The Story of a Soul by Saint Thérèse of Lisieux. Chapter 7. The Little Flower Enters the Carmel. Monday, April 9th, 1888, being the Feast of the Annunciation, transferred from Passiontide, was the day chosen for me to enter the Carmel. On the evening before, we were gathered around the table where I was to take my place for the last time. These farewells are in themselves heart-rending, and just when I would have liked to be forgotten, I received the tenderest expressions of affection, as if to increase the pain of parting. The next morning, after a last look at the happy home of my childhood, I set out for the Carmel, where we all heard Mass. At the moment of communion, when Jesus had entered our hearts, I heard sobs on all sides. I did not shed a tear, but as I led the way to the cloister door, my heart beat so violently that I wondered if I were going to die. Oh, the agony of that moment! One must have experienced it in order to understand. I embraced my dear ones and knelt for my father's blessing. He too knelt down and blessed me through his tears. It was a sight to gladden the angels, this old man giving his child to God while she was yet in the springtime of life. At length the doors of the Carmel closed upon me. I found a welcome in your arms, dear mother, and received the embraces of another family, whose devotedness and love is not dreamt of by the outside world. At last my desires were realized, and I cannot describe the deep, sweet peace which filled my soul. This peace has remained with me during the 8.5 years of my life here, and has never left me, even amid the greatest trials. Everything in the convent delighted me, especially our little cell. Editor's note: nuns, in the spirit of poverty, avoid using the word "my" as denoting private possessions. So later on, our lamp, our handkerchief, will occur. I fancied myself transported to the desert. I repeat that my happiness was calm and peaceful. Not even the lightest breeze ruffled the tranquil waters on which my little ship sailed. No cloud darkened the blue sky. I felt fully recompensed for all I had gone through, and I kept saying, "Now I am here forever." Mine was no passing joy. It did not fade like first illusions. From illusions, God in His mercy has ever preserved me. I found the religious life just what I expected, and sacrifice was never a matter of surprise. Yet you know well that from the beginning my ways were strewn with thorns rather than with roses. In the first place, my soul had for its daily food the bread of spiritual dryness. Then too, dear mother, our Lord allowed you, unconsciously, to treat me very severely. You found fault with me whenever you met me. I remember once I had left a cobweb in the cloister, and you said to me before the whole community, "It is easy to see that our cloisters are swept by a child of 15. It is disgraceful. Go and sweep away that cobweb, and be more careful in future." On the rare occasions when I spent an hour with you for spiritual direction, you seemed to be scolding me nearly all the time. And what pained me most was that I did not see how to correct my faults. For instance, my slow ways and want of thoroughness in my duties, faults which you were careful to point out. One day it occurred to me that you would certainly prefer me to spend my free time in work instead of in prayer, as was my custom. So I plied my needle industriously without even raising my eyes. No one ever knew of this, as I wished to be faithful to our Lord and do things solely for Him to see. When I was a postulant, our mistress used to send me every afternoon at 4:30 to weed the garden. This was a real penance. The more so, dear mother, because I was almost sure to meet you on the way, and once you remarked, "Really, this child does absolutely nothing. What are we to think of a novice who must have a walk every day?" And yet, dear mother, how grateful I am to you for giving me such a sound and valuable training. It was an inestimable grace. What should I have become if, as the world outside believed, I had been but the pet of the community? Perhaps, instead of seeing our Lord in the person of my superiors, I should only have considered the creature, and my heart, which had been so carefully guarded in the world, would have been ensnared by human affection in the cloister. Happily, your motherly prudence saved me from such a disaster. And not only in this matter, but in other and more bitter trials, I can truly say that suffering opened her arms to me from the first, and I took her to my heart. In the solemn examination before my profession, I declared, as was customary, the reason of my entry into the Carmel. I have come to save souls, and especially to pray for priests. One cannot attain the end without adopting the means, and as our Lord made me understand that it was by the cross He would give me souls, the more crosses I met with, the stronger grew my attraction to suffering. For 5 years this way was mine, but I alone knew it. This was precisely the flower I wished to offer to Jesus, a hidden flower which keeps its perfume only for heaven. 2 months after my entry, Father Pichon was surprised at the workings of grace in my soul. He thought my piety childlike, and my path an easy one. My conversation with this good father would have brought me great comfort, had it not been for the extreme difficulty I found in opening my heart. Nevertheless, I made a general confession, and after it he said to me, "Before God, the Blessed Virgin, and angels, and all the saints, I declare that you have never committed a mortal sin. Thank God for the favors He has so freely bestowed on you, without any merit on your part." Without any merit on my part, that was not difficult to believe. Fully conscious of my weakness and imperfection, my heart overflowed with gratitude. I had distressed myself, fearing that I might have stained my baptismal robe. And this assurance, coming as it did from the lips of a director, a man of wisdom and holiness, such as our mother Saint Teresa had desired, seemed to come from God Himself. Father Pichon added, "May our Lord always be your superior and your novice master." And indeed he ever was, and also my director. In saying this, I do not mean to imply that I was not communicative with my superiors. Far from being reserved, I tried to be always like an open book. Our mistress was a true saint, the perfect type of the first Carmelites, and I seldom left her side, for she had to teach me how to work. Her kindness was beyond words. I loved and appreciated her. And yet my soul did not expand. I could not explain myself. Words failed me. And so the time of spiritual direction became a veritable martyrdom. One of the older nuns seemed to understand what I felt, for she once said to me during recreation, "I should think, child, you have not much to tell your superiors." "Why do you think that, dear mother?" I asked. "Because your soul is very simple. But when you are perfect, you will become more simple still. The nearer one approaches God, the simpler one becomes." This good mother was right. Nevertheless, the great difficulty I found in opening my heart, though it came from simplicity, was a genuine trial. Now, however, without having lost my simplicity, I am able to express my thoughts with the greatest ease. I have already said that our Lord himself had acted as my spiritual guide. Hardly had Father Pichon become my director when his superiors sent him to Canada. I was only able to hear from him once in the year. So now the little flower which had been transplanted to the mountain of Carmel quickly turned to the Director of Directors, and unfolded itself under the shadow of his cross, having for refreshing dew his tears, his precious blood, and for radiant sun, his adorable face. Until then I had not appreciated the beauties of the holy face. It was my dear mother, Agnes of Jesus, who unveiled them to me. As she had been the first of her sisters to enter the Carmel, so she was the first to penetrate the mysteries of love hidden in the face of our divine spouse. Then she showed them to me, and I understood better than ever in what true glory consists. He whose kingdom is not of this world taught me that the only royalty to be coveted lies in being unknown and esteemed as nothing, and in the joy of self-abasement. And I wished that my face, like the face of Jesus, should be, as it were, hidden and despised, so that no one on earth should esteem me. I thirsted to suffer and to be forgotten. Most merciful has been the way by which the Divine Master has ever led me. He has never inspired me with any desire and left it unsatisfied. And that is why I have always found his bitter chalice full of sweetness. At the end of May, Marie, our eldest, was professed, and Thérèse, the Benjamin, had the privilege of crowning her with roses on the day of her mystical espousal. After this happy feast, trials again came upon us. Ever since the first attack of paralysis, we realized that my father was very easily tired. During our journey to Rome, I often noticed that he seemed exhausted and in pain. But above all, I remarked his progress in the path of holiness. He had succeeded in obtaining a complete mastery over the impetuosity of his natural disposition, and earthly things were unable to ruffle his calm. Let me give you an instance. During our pilgrimage, we were in the train for days and nights together, and to while away the time, our companions played cards, and occasionally grew very noisy. One day they asked us to join them, but we refused, saying we knew little about the game. We did not find the time long, only too short indeed to enjoy the beautiful views which opened before us. Presently their annoyance became evident, and then dear papa began quietly to defend us, pointing out that as we were on pilgrimage, more of our time might be given to prayer. One of the players, forgetting the respect due to age, called out thoughtlessly, "Thank God, Pharisees are rare." My father did not answer a word. He even seemed pleased. And later on he found an opportunity of shaking hands with this man, and of speaking so pleasantly that the latter must have thought his rude words had either not been heard, or at least were forgotten. His habit of forgiveness did not date from this day. My mother and all who knew him bore witness that no uncharitable word ever passed his lips. His faith and generosity were likewise equal to any trial. This is how he announced my departure to one of his friends. "Thérèse, my little queen, entered the Carmel yesterday." God alone could ask such a sacrifice, but he helps me so mightily that even in the midst of tears my heart is overflowing with joy. This faithful servant must needs receive a reward worthy of his virtues, and he himself claimed that reward. You remember the interview when he said to us, "Children, I have just come back from Alençon, and there, in the church of Notre Dame, I received such graces and consolations that I made this prayer: My God, it is too much. Yes, I am too happy. I shall not get to heaven like this. I wish to suffer something for thee." And I offered myself as a... The word victim died on his lips. He dared not pronounce it before us, but we understood. You know, dear mother, the story of our trial. I need not recall its sorrowful details. And now my clothing day drew near. Contrary to all expectations, my father had recovered from a second attack, and the bishop fixed the ceremony for January 10th. The time of waiting had been long indeed, but now what a beautiful feast! Nothing was wanting, not even snow. Do you remember my telling you, mother, how fond I am of snow? While I was still quite small, its whiteness entranced me. Why had I such a fancy for snow? Perhaps it was because, being a little winter flower, my eyes first saw the earth clad in its beautiful white mantle. So on my clothing day I wished to see it decked like myself in spotless white. The weather was so mild that it might have been spring, and I no longer dared hope for snow. The morning of the feast brought no change, and I gave up my childish desire as impossible to be realized. My father came to meet me at the enclosure door, his eyes full of tears, and pressing me to his heart exclaimed, "Ah, here is my little queen!" Then, giving me his arm, we made our solemn entry into the public chapel. This was his day of triumph, his last feast on earth. Now his sacrifice was complete, and his children belonged to God. Céline had already confided to him that later on she also wished to leave the world for the Carmel. On hearing this, he was beside himself with joy. "Let us go before the blessed sacrament," he said, "and thank God for all the graces he has granted us, and the honor he has paid me in choosing his spouses from my household. God has indeed done me great honor in asking for my children. If I possessed anything better, I would offer it to him." That something better was himself. And God received him as a victim of Holocaust. He tried him as gold in the furnace, and found him worthy of himself. After the ceremony in the chapel, I re-entered the convent, and the bishop intoned the Te Deum. One of the priests observed to him that this hymn of thanksgiving was only sung at professions, but once begun, it was continued to the end. Was it not right that this feast should be complete, since in it all other joyful days were reunited? The instant I set foot in the enclosure again, my eyes fell on the statue of the child Jesus smiling on me amid the flowers and lights. Then, turning toward the quadrangle, I saw that, in spite of the mildness of the weather, it was covered with snow. What a delicate attention on the part of Jesus! Gratifying the least wish of his little spouse, he even sent her this. Where is the creature so mighty that he can make one flake of snow fall to please his beloved? Everyone was amazed, and since then many people, hearing of my desire, have described this event as the little miracle of my clothing day, and thought it strange that I should be so fond of snow. So much the better. It shows still more the wonderful condescension of the spouse of virgins, of him who loves lilies white as the snow. After the ceremony, the bishop entered. He gave me many proofs of his fatherly tenderness, and, in presence of all the priests, spoke of my visit to Bayeux, and the voyage to Rome. Nor did he forget to tell them how I had put up my hair before visiting him. Then, laying his hand on my head, he blessed me affectionately. My mind dwelt with ineffable sweetness on the caresses our Lord will soon lavish on me before all the saints, and this consoling thought was a foretaste of heaven. I have just said that January the 10th was a day of triumph for my dear father. I liken it to the feast of the entry of Christ into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. As in the case of our Divine Master, his day of triumph was followed by long days of sorrow. And even as the agony of Jesus pierced the heart of his Divine Mother, so our hearts were deeply wounded by the humiliations and sufferings of him whom we loved best on earth. I remember that in the month of June 1888, when we were fearing another stroke of paralysis, I surprised our novice mistress by saying, "I am suffering a great deal, Mother. Yet I feel I can suffer still more." I did not then foresee the trial awaiting us. I did not know that on February 12th, 1 month after my clothing day, our beloved Father would drink so deeply of such a bitter chalice. I no longer said I could suffer more. Words cannot express our grief, nor shall I attempt to describe it here. In heaven we shall enjoy dwelling on these dark days of exile. Yet the 3 years of my father's martyrdom seemed to me the sweetest and most fruitful of our lives. I would not exchange them for the most sublime ecstasies, and my heart cries out in gratitude for such a priceless treasure. We have rejoiced for the days wherein thou hast afflicted us. Precious and sweet was this bitter cross, and our hearts only breathed out sighs of grateful love. We no longer walked, we ran, we flew along the path of perfection. Léonie and Céline, though living in the world, were no longer of the world. The letters they wrote were full of the most edifying resignation. And what talks I had with Céline! Far from separating us, the grating of the Carmel united us more closely. The same thoughts, the same desires, the same love for our Lord and for souls made our very life. Not a word concerning things of earth entered into our conversation, but just as in former days we lifted longing eyes to heaven, so now our hearts strained after the joys beyond time and space, and for the sake of an eternal happiness we chose to suffer and be despised here below. Though my suffering seemed to have reached its height, yet my attraction thereto did not grow less, and soon my soul shared in the trials my heart had to bear. My spiritual aridity increased, and I found no comfort either in heaven or on earth. Yet amid these waters of tribulation that I had so thirsted for, I was the happiest of mortals. Thus passed the time of my betrothal. Too long a time for me. At the end of the year you told me, dear mother, that I must not yet think about my profession, as our ecclesiastical superior expressly forbid it. I had therefore to wait for 8 months more. At first I found it very difficult to be resigned to such a sacrifice, but divine light penetrated my soul before long. At this time I was using for my meditations Surin's Foundations of the Spiritual Life. One day during prayer it was brought home to me that my too eager desire to take my vows was mingled with much self-love. As I belonged to our Lord, and was his little plaything to console and please him, it was for me to do his will, not for him to do mine. I also understood that a bride would not be pleasing to the bridegroom on her wedding day, were she not magnificently attired. But what had I made ready? So I said to our Lord, I do not ask thee to hasten the day of my profession. I will wait as long as thou pleasest. Only I cannot bear that through any fault of mine my union with thee should be delayed. I will set to work and carefully prepare a wedding dress enriched with diamonds and precious stones, and when thou findest it sufficiently rich, I am sure that nothing will keep thee from accepting me as thy spouse. I took up the task with renewed zest. Since my clothing day, I had received abundant lights on religious perfection, chiefly concerning the vow of poverty. Whilst I was a postulant, I liked to have nice things to use, and to find everything needful ready to hand. Jesus bore with me patiently, for he gives his light little by little. At the beginning of my spiritual life, about the age of 14, I used to ask myself how, in the days to come, I should more clearly understand the true meaning of perfection. I imagined I then understood it completely. But I soon came to realize that the more one advances along this path, the farther one seems from the goal. and now I am resigned to be always imperfect, and I even find joy therein. To return to the lessons which our Lord taught me. One evening after Compline, I searched in vain for our lamp on the shelves where they are kept, and, as it was the time of the Great Silence, I could not recover it. I guessed rightly that a sister, believing it to be her own, had taken it, but just on that evening I had counted on doing some work, and was I to spend a whole hour in the dark on account of this mistake? Without the interior light of grace, I should undoubtedly have pitied myself. But with that light, I felt happy instead of aggrieved, and reflected that poverty consists in being deprived not only of what is convenient, but of what is necessary. And in this exterior darkness, I found my soul illumined by a brightness that was divine. At this time I was seized with a craving for whatever was ugly and inconvenient, and was thus quite pleased when a pretty little jug was taken from our cell, and a large chipped one put in its place. I also tried hard not to make excuses, but I found this very difficult, especially with our mistress. From her I did not like to hide anything. My first victory was not a great one, but it cost me a great deal. A small jar left behind a window was found broken. No one knew who had put it there, but our novice mistress was displeased, and thinking I was to blame in leaving it about, told me I was very untidy, and must be more careful in future. Without answering, I kissed the ground and promised to be more observant. I was so little advanced in virtue that these little sacrifices cost me dear, and I had to console myself with the thought that at the day of judgment all would be known. Above all, I endeavored to practice little hidden acts of virtue. Thus I took pleasure in folding the mantles forgotten by the sisters, and I sought for every possible occasion of helping them. One of God's gifts was a great attraction toward penance, but I was not permitted to satisfy it. The only mortification allowed me consisted in mortifying my self-love, and this did me far more good than bodily penance would have done. However, Our Lady helped me with my wedding dress, and as soon as it was finished, every obstacle vanished, and my profession was fixed for September 8th, 1890. All that I have set down in these few words would take many pages to relate, but those pages will never be read on earth. Notes. Léonie, having entered an order too severe for her delicate health, had been obliged to return home to her father. Later she became a visitation nun at Caen, and took the name of Sister Frances Teresa. Reader's note. You probably get that the diamonds and precious stones and all that were actually sacrifices, but anyway, that's what they are. End of Chapter 7.